Hello, folks. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this Pterodactyl guest talk with award-winning writer Lauren Markham. It's great to see so many of you here. I see some of our new fellows and some who've been in the program for years. It's great to see you all, and hopefully I see some new faces I don't recognize as well. Thanks for joining us. My name is Greg Findley. I'm the director of Pterodactyl's 12-week flagship course, Climate Change Learning for Action. And this talk today is the keynote for the fellows in our newly launched Pangolin cohort of Learning for Action. And it's also one of the expert guest talks for the fellows in our ongoing Okapi cohort. By the way, we name our cohorts after endangered species, and we're going in alphabetical order. These two cohorts together represent over 250 fellows from more than 35 countries, and they come from a broad range of professional backgrounds. And they're all here to do something about climate change. The Learning for Action course is an intensive exploration of climate science, climate impacts, and climate solutions. It's a combination of written classes and live weekly lab sessions, deep dives, and expert guest talks and workshops, all intended to help the fellows learn about climate change so they can find their role in working to address it. Pterodactyl was founded in 2020 with an ambitious goal of getting 100 million people working on climate change this decade. We offer a new cohort of this course starting approximately every 6 weeks, and we urge you to check it out if you want to learn more about how you can become involved in addressing climate change. Our next cohort begins on March 10th. Before we get started with this talk, I'd love to go over a few points about the Zoom session. It seems everyone is muted, but please continue to keep yourself muted so we can all hear our speaker. Following the talk, we should have some time for questions and answers, although we will prioritize questions from our current fellows using Slido. And fellows, you can find a link to that Slido in your respective Slack channels. So I'm very excited that Lauren Markham is here to speak with us today. Lauren is an award-winning fiction writer, essayist, and journalist, and her work most often concerns issues related to youth, migration, the environment, and her home state of California. She has reported from the border regions of Greece and Mexico and Thailand and Texas, from Arctic Norway, from gang-controlled regions of El Salvador, from depopulating towns in rural Sardinia and rural Guatemala too, from homeschool havens in Southern California, from imperiled forests in Oregon and Washington, from the offices of overwhelmed immigration lawyers in LA and Tijuana, and from the upscale haunts of women scammed on the Upper East Side. She's the author of the recent A Map of Future Ruins on Borders and Belonging, which the New Yorker listed as one of the best books we've read in 2024, and which Kirkus Reviews called a remarkable, unnerving, and cautionary portrait of a global immigration crisis. Her first book, The Faraway Brothers, Two Young Migrants and the Making of an American Life, won numerous awards, and National Public Radio in the US said, "You should read The Faraway Brothers. We all should." Her third book, Immemorial, will be published, I believe, next week. It's coming out in February 2025, and it is a speculative essay on language in the face of climate catastrophe, how we memorialize what has been lost and what soon will be, pushing public imagination into generative terms. She's here to talk about this and what she writes elsewhere about immigration and climate grief, and her talk today is titled Climate Grief and What to Do with It. I'm so honored to have Lauren with us. Lauren, thanks so much, and I'll pass it to you.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you for having me, Greg, and Dan, and everyone from Pterodactyl. And thank you all for being here. So I'm going to read from a little bit from this book, but also share some images, just as kind of a way to get into this question of climate grief and what we do with it. And we this will just be a launch point for further discussion. I'll have some other things to share with you, but kind of a core question in this book and in my life for the past few years is sort of what we do with climate grief, per the name of this talk, but also this kind of haunting question of how we grieve the future, which is a syntactical problem and I think an ethical problem. And it's a brain tangle. How do we grieve the future? We don't know exactly what the future will bring, and yet we know that catastrophe is here and catastrophe is coming. How do we grieve the abstracted casualties of the future? And how do we work with our grief such that it's not a total immobilizer? So those are sort of core questions at the heart of this book, and I'm going to read a little bit from it while showing you some stuff. All right. Years ago, before I became a parent, I had a low-paid job that required me to travel to Slovenia every summer and drive a bunch of writing students around the country in a large, unwieldy van. My employers treated me poorly, but back then you could ask me to do anything if it involved a free plane ticket. The world was big and it beckoned. I thought only of what I could afford and little of its environmental costs. My flight home from Slovenia almost always passed over Greenland. For the better part of an hour, I would press my face against the window to become transfixed by the great frozen world below. I knew to sit on the right side of the plane and stay awake long enough to catch sight of it, all that precious ice. Once it came into view, I'd feel newly shaken by its beauty, as if encountering it for the very first time. Though the sight of it would also awaken all the memories of years past when I'd stared out the window just like this one with the same unplaceable longing for the mysterious, unknown to me landscape down below. Memory often functions this way, in layers, in echo. Much of this ice would be gone soon, I knew, and so this annual sky-high ritual became an anticipatory memorial to that vanishing world. The circumstances of my life changed, and I stopped going to Slovenia every summer. I mostly traveled as a journalist now, more free plane tickets. Meanwhile, the climate crisis was becoming harder to ignore. It was something I wrote a lot about in the magazines that paid me to travel the world. The irony was not lost on me. A couple years ago, when I was returning from a reporting trip to Greece, my plane passed over the Alps. The snow-mantled crags reminded me of Greenland, of the way it felt to behold an astonishing landscape from above, with an awareness that it was slipping away. By then, air travel had become a more fraught enterprise. In 2017, complicit was named a word of the year, but ever since, it had paradoxically become something of a linguistic escape hatch. Simply admit your complicity, and then you'd subverted it, free now to fly on by to the next destination, to the rest of your complicit life. When it came to the ice, I was complicit. I was in awe. I was stuck in that awe and in that complicity and in my seat on that Boeing 777. I longed for that alpine ice like one longs for a dead thing, but the ice was right there. Was it that I longed to be down upon the ice, enjoying its final days? Or was I simply longing for its fixedness upon the map of the world? Any attempt to parse the exact contours of all this, or to put it into words, melted like a handful of snow. So I placed my phone against the window and took a picture of the Alps' jagged winter shadows, as if trying to secure the scene in place. The snow-dusted Alps, I posted on Instagram for my layover in Switzerland. What's a word for the simultaneous enchantment of beholding the breathtaking world from above and the feeling of complicity for its destruction? Guilt-chantment? My friend Holly replied. Blissonance is our most popular term for this very real phenomenon, Blue Heart posted someone from an account called the Bureau of Linguistical Reality. The Bureau of Linguistical Reality. It sounded both ominous and spellbinding, like a trapdoor situated deep in the forest. How could one help but fall through? I looked them up. The operation was the brainchild of Bay Area artists Alicia Escott and Heidi Quante, who, like me, had found themselves, quote, at a loss for words to describe the very real emotions and feelings of a rapidly changing world. Escott is co-founder and executive director of Interspecies Advancement and treasurer of Geologic Time. Quante is co-founder and chief catalyst of New Words and Worlds. The artists graph their work to the concept of linguistical relativity, which suggests that language available to the speakers who speak it determines how they see the world and thus how they act within it. We reference this term playfully, the founders write, but believe sincerely that until we have found language to describe the changing world around us, we will not be able to fully grasp what is happening. The Bureau publishes their ever-expanding dictionary online, and I scrolled through their words, entranced by the possibilities of a shape-shifting language to match the shape-shifting world. Wilt was one of them. To cause wilting in plants by not providing proper horticultural care out of concern for water consumption, especially during a time of drought, the feeling of regret and responsibility for their wilting. Pre-traumatic stress disorder, a condition in which a researcher experiences symptoms of trauma as they learn more about the future as it pertains to climate change and watch the world around them not making necessary precautions. Sound familiar? At the time, I'd been reading a fair bit about climate-related trauma. As the activist Britt Ray writes in her book, Generation Dread, climate change and ecological breakdown, ongoing threats to life that they are, create their own order of trauma and become a new lens through which we see the world. I'd also been thinking a lot about memory and forgetting and how those unsteady acts of the mind map to grief. The feeling of grieving something that isn't yet gone and whose disappearance isn't fully certain, nor can its timeline be predicted, is an eerie and off putting one. How do we mourn the abstracted casualties of the future? Grief can feel like a physical mass. Where to put it? This brought me back to language, the importance of effectively naming and ordering things. In her book, Ray suggests that we must find a container for our overwhelming emotions. I pictured a rummage sale heap of baskets and tea tins and old cigar boxes, each perfectly suited to hold what was placed inside. I had shared the photograph on Instagram because I had an instinct that acknowledging my complicity would somehow make me feel better about it, but also because I was searching for company in my grief and a place for it to go. Surely there was a better container than an iPhone photograph, an online post. Where do we go to mourn? We go to grave sites and to holy places, and we go to memorials. Memorials had been something of a lifelong fascination for me. If grief is the cavernous emotion nearly ubiquitous to human life, and mourning is the ritualized enactment of that feeling, then a memorial seemed to offer a space for both the feeling and its enactment to be made communally manifest in the physical world. Were there memorials to hold our climate grief? Maybe this is what I've been longing for above those iced over worlds. I sent the Bureau of Linguistical Reality an email. I'm in need of a word, I wrote, and perhaps you two are just the people to help. I hastily described what I was after, a word that expresses the desire to memorialize something that is lost, that is in the process of being lost. A landscape, for instance, or a species or a bird song. To erect a memory temple or shrine or lyric monument of sorts to the feeling of losing something as it's going. I struggled with the words to describe the very word I wanted. But I got a quick reply. We would love to collaborate with you to create a neologism for the more memorializing phenomena below. We arranged a time to talk. In 1980, a Yale undergraduate enrolled in a seminar on funereal architecture. The Vietnam Memorial Fund had sent out a call for proposals for the construction of a new memorial to be erected on the Washington Mall. As an academic exercise, the students in the Yale class were tasked with coming up with a proposal for the memorial's design. Maya Lin was only 21 years old when she enrolled in the class at Yale, but she had been studying memorials for years. She would later write of her disappointment in the majority of the designs she'd been presented with at university. Most memorials, she found, were largely exercises in nationalism that commemorated the past with some degree of emptiness. These structures, she wrote, carried larger, more general messages about a leader's victory or accomplishment rather than the lives lost. Lynn used her school assignments to advance a different kind of design, but her efforts were generally met with contempt. Early in her college career, a professor asked his students to design a memorial to those who died in World War II. Lynn submitted her assignment, and the professor responded poorly. He chastised her. If he were a family member of someone who died in the war, he sniped, he would have been horrified to visit her memorial. But that didn't sway her vision. When it came to developing a design for the Vietnam Memorial assignment, Lynn was not interested in merely lionizing the dead, but in building a space where the living could mourn. I wanted to create a memorial that everyone would be able to respond to, she said, regardless of whether one thought our country should or should not have participated in the war, she said. I imagined taking a knife and cutting the earth, opening it up, and the initial violence and pain that in time would heal. The grass would grow back, but the initial cut would remain a pure, flat surface in the earth with a polished, mirrored surface, much like the surface on a geode when you cut in and polish the edge. It would be an interface between our world and the quieter, darker, more peaceful world beyond. I never looked at the memorial as a wall, an object, but as an edge to the earth, an open side. She submitted her design to both professor and the selection committee. Her professor gave her a B, but her design was chosen. All right. One of the functions of a memorial is to offer a space for communal mourning and remembrance. This is what Maya Lin shows us. Even if a person's memorial-induced catharsis takes place privately, it does so side by side with others. Such experimental companionship was another reason the memorial format was alluring to me. I know I'm not alone in my climate grief, or eco-anxiety as it's otherwise known. According to a recent Yale study, roughly 7% of US adults are experiencing some form of climate anxiety, and youth are hit worst of all. In a 2021 survey of 10 different countries, 60% of youth reported feeling very or extremely worried about the future of the planet. This worry, many said, affected their ability to function in their daily lives, the choices they made, the closeness and quality of their relationships, their general health, and what they felt was possible for their futures. Part of the trouble with metabolizing climate grief is to do so requires grieving many abstractions at once. We're grieving the species and landscape and people that the Anthropocene has fundamentally altered or destroyed. And then there's the painful truth to grieve that humans are the ones to blame. And then there's that particularly unsteady, ghostly form of grief for losses that are at once certain. We know the glaciers will melt and the sea will rise and the forest will burn, and yet not fully known in terms of their timeline or precise manifestations. It takes some coming to terms with the simultaneous truths that we are small amid the mighty forces of destruction and also capable of affecting change. It can be dizzying to hold all of these things, and the grief itself can get in the way. It's also disorienting to move through a transfiguring world. Not long ago, when I was 6 months pregnant, my partner and I flew to southern Mexico to spend some time at the beach. We stayed a few miles up the coast from a steady surf break with a lip you could ride all the way to the shore. Our rental was paradise in the most prototypical postcard sense of the word. The sea's effervescent churn cradled us all through the night. The first morning, Ben left before daybreak to greet the waves, and I got up a few hours later, meeting a sky so broad and bright that it was as if someone had flung the shutters open upon the entire universe, letting in its light. And I headed to the beach. The sand was covered with a rust-colored foam. I scurried uphill with each wave to avoid the frothy heaps. And then I almost stepped on it, a dead pufferfish lying in the sand. It was bloated, its skin distended like a spiked, too-tight balloon. Because its eyes were popped wide open, the creature gave the appearance of looking both shocked and ready to explode. I was so taken with this one dead fish that it took me a while to notice another one just a few feet away, and then another, and then another. I scanned the beach. There were hundreds of these aquatic corpses scattered upon the sand and far into the distance, as though someone had detonated a bomb in the shallows. I avoided the cadavers as though they were both precious objects I might break and deadly landmines, but even so, I nearly walked across a 4-foot shark, curled, sagged, and dead upon the sand. Like I had above the Greenland and the Greenland Alps, Greenland and the Alps, I took out my phone. It was pure instinct. I snapped picture after picture, unable to stop myself from adjusting the dead fish within the frames, leaning and bending for the right angle, settling down onto my knees. There was something sacrilegious about it, and I was aware of the screen's utility in both connecting me to and distancing me from death. A red tide, it turned out, had recently swept the coast of Guerrero. Climate change causes a warming sea in which toxic algae can bloom suddenly and far more frequently, suffocating the creatures that make the sea their home. It would be months before I looked at the pictures of the dead fish, but I didn't delete them. They were stored alongside so many other ghosts. Photos I'd taken of fire-charred hillsides of the Sierra not far from where I lived, piles of plastic fishermen pulled from their nets from the Aegean in Greece, a destroyed barn I once saw in Vermont after Hurricane Irene. I had long feared that my instinctual desire to record the ravages of climate change was a ghoulish effort to capture, in the rough language of social media, and to use what I caught to perform feelings for others, not merely as an act of showmanship, but as a failure to sort out how to adequately feel and what to do about it. But now I was beginning to suspect that the instinct was something far more complex, an almost biological impulse to record what was becoming invisible, not all that distinct from my impulse toward memorial. Writing of climate trauma and generation dread, Ray speaks of a generational capture imperative, in a sense distinct from the empty social media blip. Dread is a resource floating freely in the air, she writes, and it's this generation's job to capture it. It seemed my photographs were, in part, a gesture toward action, something to do rather than just something to feel. Could grief be raw material of creation? Could memories of the vanishing world be not merely vessels for grief, but an alchemical force to transform that grief into something else? All right, so that's a little bit from the book, and I'm going to keep talking, and I won't show you any more pictures of sad dead things, although these are, even though that's actually what I'm doing right now. So this is, what you read is the sort of beginning of a quest that I undertook for a few years to look for, create, imagine memorials related to climate change that sort of served the function of the Lynn Memorial. I loved the way she talked about, with all the complications of that war and frankly that memorial itself. I was so taken with the way she described memorial and the her instincts to create as something effectively metaphorical, something she was creating a physical space that transcended both language and the space itself as a portal into feeling. And that was really moving to me. And I thought, well, where are the memorials to climate change? turns out I didn't have to look all that far, although I did look far and wide. But this is something called ghost forest. So I'm going to share some of these with you. I'm going to share some of the uh, some some of my quest, the results of my quest. And this is, does this familiar to anyone? I actually realize I'm not looking at the chat and I should be. Oh, thanks so much, everyone. So this is an installation called Ghost Forest by none other than Maya Lin. Turns out Maya Lin, I'd had this, I write about this in the book, but I'd had this sort of really meaningful experience with this memorial when I was her Vietnam Veterans Memorial when I was a tween, and was determined to just be annoyed and that my dad was making me go visit all of these memorials in DC. And then I just had this like incredibly moving experience there, against all my desire to just be surly and unmoved. And that same person, it turned out, years later, more than 20 years later, after I had encountered that, I was in New York and encountered this, which is Ghost Forest. So if you can see, this is in Madison Square Park. You can see this is a park in New York. And this is, you can see all of the alive trees around it. She created this incredibly eerie installation where these are Atlantic white cedars, which have been in the Pine Barrens of the southeastern US, have been these forests, like acres, hundreds and hundreds of acres of forest, thousands and thousands of acres of forest have been decimated because of salinating soil. So these trees have essentially been suffocated out. So what she did, she went there at one point and was just so kind of moved and devastated by the visual feeling of the loss that she transported 40 of these trees. She was like, other people should see this. And so what she did was she transported 40 of these trees and planted these dead trees for a year in Madison Square Park. And she did it for exactly a year so that while the living trees around this stand of dead trees would continue their cycle of living. They would drop their trees in the fall, they would go bare like these trees in the winter, they would bloom again. These dead trees would actually functionally keep she actually said it was interesting what happened wasn't just that they stayed static dead, they continued to gray out. So they changed in death while the living trees changed in life. It was super, super moving. And I just went back again and again. And one of the moving parts about this is, she was like, I am bringing the death. She made, to me, she was making art of the death itself, right? She was making a memorial from the stuff of the grief itself. But the other moving thing was that in the hubbub of like being in New York, one could walk through this park and kind of not even notice. This was like June. This was probably around or maybe July. This was like late July. So obviously, like, what are these? They are clearly dead. But even still, you could have like walked through and just kind of barely noticed, right? Another installation that I wanted to share, and again, this might be, you all might be really familiar with this, but this is called Ice Watch, and it's and I'm so sorry, I'm going to forget the second. It's Olafur Eliasson and another artist who did something similar with ice. So this was, they had a couple of installations, but one of them was, I believe, in the 2017 in front of the COP in Copenhagen. These are pieces of ice from a calved glacier. So they managed to transport these pieces of ice from a calved glacier and install them in front of in a what do you call it, courtyard in front of where the COP was meeting, so that people were forced to walk past the ice and encounter kind of the scale of this devastation and the fact of it, right? Both of these, to me, what was moving about them and kind of powerful about them is they so much of climate change is an abstraction, right? But these are attempts to kind of make us face the exact thing that is being lost, the devastation itself, right? It's a forced encounter, and kind of moving something from, I always think about like climate change as an abstraction until all of a sudden it's your hillside that's burning down, or your town that's being flooded, or your grandparents' house that floated away, right? So, and I think things like glaciers, especially, because most of the world does not live where glaciers are. This is like a really profound thing of sort of direct encounter with this ice. And people did all sorts of wild things. Like people went and embraced the ice. People went and put their heads to the ice. So it was also this kind of improvisational experience where the people walking through it kind of created their own private kind of rituals with this larger memorial. Now, it's interesting, neither Lynn nor Eliasson and his partner, who I'm tragically forgetting his name at this very moment, are necessarily describe what they're doing as memorials, although of course Lynn, is sort of famously one of the most famous memorial architects or artists. But these, to me, so whether they're called memorials or not, one of the things I was doing in my quest is kind of thinking, well, what are the functions of memorials, and what are some of the artworks or installations or performances that I'm finding that seem to kind of meet some of those. Another one, so this is the writer, the Icelandic writer Andris Nair Magnusson, and he actually and I forget the year, Lacey Johnson wrote beautifully about this in the New Yorker. One of the first glaciers to completely disappear, Ok Glacier in Iceland. The people in Iceland decided to hold a memorial. So hundreds of people came to this memorial, and they actually held a memorial on top of where the ice had melted and was gone, and held a memorial for this glacier. And Anders Nier Magnusson was asked to speak and also to write a plaque. So this is him standing in the water with his plaque, and this is what it said. Would anyone like to read A Letter to the Future, this in English, out loud? Abira, do you mind? Because I see that you're looking at it. Sorry. Thank you.
Sure. Oke is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it. August 2019.
Thank you so much. Great. 2019. Thank you so much, Abira. What I loved about this is that it speaks to this, the fact that any kind of memorial, and I think this is what is so compelling to me about the form and feels so moving to me as a sort of possibility for a kind of vessel and receptacle for our climate grief, is that memorials are about time, right? There's something that we do in the present or build in the present, looking backward, but also looking forward, right? And so this is speaking to the future. Only you will know if we stopped the rest of the glaciers from melting. One of the reasons I was so, grief can be an immobilizer. Grief can be something that stops us in our tracks. And I'm sure we have all, maybe some of us ourselves have experienced this, or we know somebody who has created a cave out of their climate grief and is just in a place of, gets stuck in a place of everything has gone to hell. There's no hope. Look who's elected, and, look who got elected nationally. Look who's elected around the world. The earth is screwed. We're all screwed. And, if folks haven't seen this, and I'll actually show it right now, there's a beautiful book called Not Too Late, edited by Rebecca Solnit and Thelma Young Lutunayaba, who I quote extensively in this book, which looks at things are really bad, and also not all hope is lost, right? So how does grief become not an immobilizer, but actually a mobilizer? How do we alchemize our grief into action? But also, how do we not overly focus on action, which is something I tend to do, at the expense of actually feeling and acknowledging that the grief is real and that it's having effects on us, right? So it struck me, one of the things that was so compelling to me about memorials is that they feel like these sort of temples where you go and you sort of feel the grief, and you're made to confront the grief and sometimes the causes of the grief, but also then you can sort of leave and go back into the land of the living, right? You sort of enter in some way the land of the dead, or the land of this consecrated space where you're encountering your feelings and your losses directly, and then you can move out to the land of the living, sort of having acknowledged that grief, but in some way transformed. So a few other things I want to show you. This is this really cool project by a artist named Daisy Ginsburg, called Resurrecting the Sublime, where she did this really cool stuff. She worked with these, she looked at extinct flowers and studied all these extinct flowers, like some from thousands of years ago and some from more recently, and worked with paleogeneticists, I believe, to figure out what the flowers might have smelled like and create approximations of what the flowers might have smelled like. And then she created these kind of wild diorama spaces where you could walk into and smell that approximation of the flowers, which I thought was so cool. And then this is a really beautiful. I was listening to this like kind of obsessively when I was pregnant. It's really moving and strange and eerie, but this is called Songs of Disappearance, and I'll just play a little bit of it. It's a compilation of bird song of extinct birds, extinct or endangered birds. Oh, can you guys not hear the audio?
No,
Oh,
we
no.
cannot.
Okay. Well, it's very cool. I'll put it in the chat. You must have been like, what? Sorry about that. I don't know why, but it's very cool. So I'll share it with you later. Hang on, I'm gonna have to. Okay. I wanted to share, as connected to, and I'm sorry you couldn't hear them, the really kind of eerie, beautiful, altering sounds of the extinct and endangered birds, is the poet C.A. Conrad, who uses they them pronouns. What they have this wild ritual that they do. They have a book called Resurrect Extinct Vibration, which is poems they write by going to a Walmart parking lot, standing in the middle of the parking lot, turning on like effectively a boombox that has the sounds of some extinct animal, uh, bathing themselves in the sound, kind of going to a trance space, walking into Walmart, holding the sound of that. It's like really far out and wild, holding the sound of that, holding that machine that is emanating the sound of an extinct creature, and then sort of, in their estimation, channels these poems of the of that come to them through the experience of what they feel like is connecting on a cellular level with some ancestral memory of this creature that is now lost to the world. It's really far out and cool and incredible. One of the other things I looked at is, and I'm sort of sharing this in kind of potpourri form, just as the like, in case this is interesting to you or moving to you or energizing to you in any way to kind of go down these rabbit holes like I did. But I got really interested and into futurists and futurism, and the people who were sort of imagining the future and both having to anticipate what the future is and build for that future. And some futurists are like totally spooky to me and are like, we must move to Mars and here's the plan. And others, I think, are doing much more generative, like the generative imaginative work of futurism that is also trying to, not unlike memorials, kind of influence the future with kind of a clear-eyed understanding of what has happened in the past, right? So the Future Energy Lab is this really cool firm that one of the things that they did was work with the United Arab Emirates. The UAE commissioned them to create like 5 different simulations of different energy futures of the UAE. So like business as usual, what will it look like in 20 years and 30 years and 50 years? What if emissions are cut by this much? What if you change like these, like what if you drill this much less oil, or what if you have different emission standards or whatever. And they had all sorts of kinds of simulations, but one of the things that they did was they had these little vials of what the air would be like at that time. So you would have to like encounter the noxious gas of like the business as usual in 30 years time. So they were kind of creating this direct encounter, like in certain ways like the icebergs, but with the future, not with what's already happened. So that was very cool to me. You're not going to be able to see this, but or hear this, unfortunately, but this is the
Hey,
Hawaii.
Lauren,
Well, yeah.
if you want to, you could stop sharing momentarily, and then when you go to share, there's a little button you can click to share audio, and it might work,
Oh,
and we might be able to
great.
hear.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing so we can hear we're going to end with the Hawaii OO. Okay, so you say when I go share.
There's like a, yeah, let me.
Oh, share sound. Thank you. God, how many times? Yay. All right. Oh, sorry. Now you're just seeing my photos. Hang on. Okay. So this is one of the songs. This is one of the poet C.A. Conrad. This is one of the species that they connected with and wrote poems about. And it's still not. Okay, so I wanted to stop in that immersive sound bath experience of the Hawaii OO, which I have listened to so many times, because it's, to me, such a beautiful song, and of course so devastating that I will never hear it again, that that song will never be sung again. And it brings in that critical question of grief to me, of how do we feel the sadness while not just sort of crawling into a hole and being sad forever, right? How do we create some force of alchemy for our grief to move somewhere, and to move us somewhere as individuals and as a species, and as a planet? So I'll leave it there and we can move into questions.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was amazing. First question was just how can they pre-order your book? Is there a place?
Oh, so nice. You can, I mean, I always recommend bookshop.org is a great Amazon alternative. Isn't it so cruel that Amazon, I can say this in, I think, in good company, that Amazon like co-opted the name of, this like company that's destroying the planet, co-opted the name of this sacred forest. Bookshop.org is a great Amazon alternative, and also just going to your local bookstore, writing to your local bookstore and asking for it.
Awesome. Thank you. I don't see a lot of questions yet. So folks, if you have a question, you can type it in the chat. You can add it to Slido. You can even raise your hand and we can call on you. First, Lauren, I just wanted to mention, I watched a couple of videos in preparation for this, and I don't think I heard you say the word glimmer or glimmering, which you mentioned in
Yay!
um,
Hooray! That
that's a
was
little joke. You can tell
mistake.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, those are my linguistic sticking point. That's, like and actually I write about that a lot in this book, this like the linguistic wear, that probably part of the difficulty of describing climate change is that with language, part of this book is actually like my own encounter with a crisis of language, and part of why I'm looking to memorials is because language is feeling like it's failing me, and in part because it's like, how many ways can you describe the devastation of climate change, or the ravage of the burn zone, or the, like it starts, there's like linguistic wear. And also I think we all kind of have these trap words that we fall into and overuse. One time an editor, who Dan, one time an editor was like, hey, so did a word search, use vast 15 times in this piece, and I was like, ooh, that's a lot of vasts, so glimmer and well, yeah, glimmer and gleam, I think, used to be ones that I really overused. So now I'm just overusing other ones, but I'm happy that those ones I've exercised from my overuse zone.
Yeah, thanks. And just to call out really quickly, she's talked about Dan. Dan is our content writer for our LFA textbook thing. Thanks, Dan, for being with us and for connecting us with Lauren. Before I jump to you, Freddie, I see a couple in the chat, and I'll get to those and come back to you if that's okay. The first question that I saw was from William Shan. Could you talk a little bit about the role of storytelling in meeting the climate crisis?
Yeah, that's something this book is engaging with. And actually my last book too, but in the context of migration. So I write a lot about migration, and of course the intersection between, there's a huge intersection between migration and forced migration and climate. I I believe deeply in the importance of storytelling. And also I am suspicious of people, of the instinct to, and of people who say, I believe deeply in the power of storytelling, because I don't think that every story, I think we have to think really critically about the way we're telling stories, and even the presumption that stories are in and of themselves good or powerful. I think there's sometimes a sense that like, oh, we just need more stories, we need more stories. Part of me believes that actually we have so many stories about the climate emergency that people are kind of shut down, right? That it's like too much, there's a saturation. And so I and I guess I don't have an answer, like a concrete answer, other than to say, I'm really interested in thinking critically about the kinds of stories we tell and how we tell them and the different modalities. And one of the things that really drew me about looking at memorial is that they feel like storytelling mechanisms that demands an active participation in the person who's going there, right? So it's not this sort of like, what, like I am hearing a story and washing over me, which I think can be a powerful experience, but it's like there's something about a memorial that demands encounter and participation in a way that I find moving. So I think one more concise thing that I could say is that I think that like written stories, visual stories, and also some of these like stranger performances and installations that I was sort of sharing here that I catalog in the book feel important to me as well.
Thanks. And we do have some other questions in the chat, but Freddie, I'm going to call on you. Go ahead and come off mute.
Thanks, Greg, and thank you, Lauren. You sort of answered my question before I could ask it, but maybe framing it slightly differently will maybe open something else up. Maybe not, but I think a lot about how the humanities can or cannot address our climate problem and change hearts and minds. I used to work in the music industry, and I made a few albums themed around climate, thinking that that was an effective way to get at people without direct messaging. I now work in politics where the messaging is way more direct. It's like, climate is a problem, you should vote on it. And that really turns people off because they feel like they're being told what to do. And I still believe that fiction and the arts can provide a backdoor into getting at people on the issue. And so I hear you when you say, you know, there's a barrage of stories out there that the volume of those stories may be turning people off in and of itself. But I wonder if you could maybe speak to the notion of hitting people over the head or coming at it more subtly. It's a very open, vague question, but it's something I really think about a lot.
No, I love it. I mean, I think that that's exactly what I mean. And you put it much more beautifully and clearly. Like, I think that that's exactly what I mean, that it needn't all be, you know, news stories. I mean, 100% we need news stories, and many of them, you know, for instance, like the Palisades fires or the LA fires, right? Very up very up, right? You know, for in all of our consciousness right now, I think, regardless of whether we live in LA or not, because it's this massive disaster in this very iconic place. And movie stars houses are burning down, not just regular people's, right? Which I do think actually has something to do with it. So I think that while we need politicians to be stating the obvious again and again and again, such that it becomes you know, like it continues to become the incontrovertible fact that it is, that we are in a climate emergency and must do something about it. Like, I love what you're saying about the back door, or, you know, or the side door of like, it needs to be the water we're swimming in. It's like climate stories or climate narratives or engaging with our climate emergency should be in our music and should be in our literature and should be in our memorial spaces and should be on the murals that our students are painting, you know, because, and I think that is a less didactic form that allows people to engage with our emergency in different ways at different moments in time, according to where they are and what their what their capacities are and what their interests are. And so I think if it's just like politicians and policymakers and sort of like environmentalists saying the thing, it remains a fringe issue, and it isn't, right? So yeah, I guess I'm just totally agreeing with you. I think that's really vital.
Thanks for the question, Freddie, and thanks, Lauren. Hillary, your hand is up. I'll pass to you.
Thank you so much. That was so beautiful, Lauren. I really, it brought to mind so many things that I've been thinking about. And I think it's like that chance encounter that is so powerful, more than storytelling as this vague term. It reminded me so much of those, I don't know if you've seen this as memorial, but not really memorial, these chance encounters that for the Holocaust. These little stones, the stumbling stones that are all over Europe.
Beautiful.
And it's just the moment that you just are suddenly there in person. It affects you because you're walking on something that's gold.
Yes.
That brings you into history and into this moment that is so powerful, just making the invisible visible, as we say, right? And that is, I love these examples you gave, because I'm going to keep thinking.
Yay. Yeah, the
Thank you.
stumbling stones are beautiful. I forget what the German word is for them. But
Okay.
they put them outside often of houses where people were
Yes,
murdered, people who died in the
yes,
Holocaust. And so
yes.
it's sort of I, I write about this a little bit in the book. Like what I love, I don't think I write explicitly about those, but what I do love about that project is it's not so much like this consecrated space you go to feel blah blah, blah, but like you said, it's this chance encounter, and it embeds the loss and the encounter of the loss in one's everyday experience, as opposed to this um hiding it away,
And it's controversial, right? It's taken this
Yeah.
long to get to
Right,
that little
to get
stone.
to them. Yeah, and I know someone who's really like an activist and trying to get more of them in Serbia, because people don't talk about the Holocaust in Serbia.
Wow.
Yeah,
Thank you.
so much.
Thanks, Hillary. So Tara, our instructor for us at Terra.2, asked a question, and Bettina has a similar question, and I'm curious what the answer is for you, how to hold grief and move forward in hope. And Bettina said, when you get overwhelmed with climate grief, what is your personal process?
Yeah. So it's funny. One of the things I write about in the book is that I actually am someone who's really good at not looking at my grief and focusing on action and being like, no one has time for this. Shut up. The world is burning, let's get to work. And that's true, like I work in migration, and when the election happened, it was like within 6 minutes of it becoming clear that Trump was going to be elected, like I was already planning with my coworker like a plan to support, I won't get into the details, but support all of these young people in Oakland to apply for this thing that would help them get work permits. It was like, okay. Like, I don't have time to like have a feeling about this. Like, I just got to go. And I think that is, but then what happens is I get, chronic migraines, or like I fall apart eventually, right? So one of the things that was really interesting, actually, I'll show you this book. I think I mentioned this in the book, I don't think yet. A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety. I was reading that someone at Point Reyes Books in Point Reyes, California, hand sold me this, and I was reading it, and there's this line that's like, actually, an overfocus on action is anti-intellectual, and an overfocus on action can actually be detrimental to the action that we need, because what we need is also feeling and contemplation and creativity. And if all you do is go from like, something bad happens, you don't do any contemplation or thinking about it, and you're just like, okay, act, then we're never going to create or find like the like new or more effective ways of acting, right? So I guess this is all to say, and that really stung me. I was like, anti-intellectual, how dare you? And I think it's completely true. So it's interesting that my form of grief is generally ignoring it and trying to act. And I think that comes from a good place. And also it comes from a place of wanting to avoid it. And my dad died earlier this year, and I did the exact same thing with my dad, with my dad's death. And so for me, and I think that also is what drew me about memorials, is it's like, right, remember to grieve, like remember to be in the space and grieve. And so I guess the answer that I would give like more broadly outside of like my personal tendencies and experience is that I think acknowledging that grief is important, and that actually that being in grief is important, and that attending to, engaging with spaces and rituals that allow that grief to move, right? To be felt and held, and then also potentially move, is really important.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a recent keynote we had from a writer, Mary Anais Hegler, who said that grief hurts because it's supposed to. And then Rebecca Solnit talks about how grief just means we love and we care, right? You don't grieve if you don't love. And
Right.
it's okay to sit with that a little bit and then use that to go forward.
Totally.
Thanks for all of that. Let's see. Victorija, I might have the name wrong, I apologize, but asked, what are, in your opinion, some of the most dangerous definitions, words, phrases that are currently used to talk about climate change? Do you have anything on that?
I love that question. I write about how The Guardian like decided to stop using the word climate change and talk about climate catastrophe and climate emergency, stop using climate skeptics and use climate deniers, stopped using, I think, biodiversity and talked more about wildlife. Like, I'm not saying that those are harmful terms, but I do appreciate any effort to call things more directly as they are, and to, I'm seeing a lot more climate chaos being used. So I think when we can call things more explicitly and directly as they are, and move away from sometimes like more abstracted science words, even though science is incredibly important, I'm not being anti-science, but in terms of how we talk about these things, like, can we talk about them in terms that are vivid and ways that regular people can understand and don't sound like abstractions? That to me is what I've been thinking about and focusing on. So it's less about like harmful terms and more like opportunities for and this sounds like PR-ish, and I guess it is, but I don't just mean that. It's like, yeah, this is climate chaos, right? This isn't like this, yes, climate change, but this is chaos. Like, look, this is chaos. And part of the problem is, I was just in Greece a couple weeks ago, actually, when the LA fires started, researching the impacts of climate change on the olive harvest. And it's not that there isn't enough rain, it's that the rain comes at the wrong times, right? It's chaos. It's not just change, it's chaotic change.
Thanks. We have a question. Have you addressed climate doomerism in young people in particular? And how do you adapt climate grief counseling with them, or how would you recommend?
So interesting. I don't write that much about it, and I would say I don't know that that's an area that I've looked into enough. It's hard because the doomerism, I feel more, I feel kinder and more, yeah, I feel more tender toward a doomerism among a very young person than I do like someone my age or older. I'm 41. Because my age or older, I'm like, snap out of it, do something, you know what I mean? And a younger person, I'm like, I get it. Like, how sucky, I mean, I think I've worked with adolescents a lot. I do think it is very much like an adolescent experience, and part of adolescence is sort of beholding the world and all of its problems and trying to metabolize that. So I think I have less of an instinct of like snap out of it, and more of an instinct toward creating opportunity, like validating, acknowledging, and sort of creating pathways of opportunities for them to feel either in community about. I mean, what the research shows is that, and I haven't even said this yet, but like the best antidotes to climate to doomerism, climate doomerism, is like being in community, right? And having something to do, feeling as though there's something you're doing, small or big. So kind of creating those pathways for young people.
Great. Surya asks a question: how can climate change memorials effectively balance narratives of loss with those of resilience and adaptation? And how do we ensure there is focus more towards a call to action rather than contributing further to climate grief paralysis?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question at the heart of my book. I do think there's something really interesting about I write in the book about people who are creating things out of the wreckage. So this one guy who has created these sort of wild steampunk sculptures in southern France, I believe. Yeah, southern France, out of the drought. There's all this mud from the drought because the it's on a riverbank, and so he's created these incredible sculptures out of mud, and that has on the riverbanks because there's not enough water moving through it. And then I write about the artist Nicholas Galanin, who is doing some really interesting memorial work, or memorial adjacent work in the South, where he's planting indigenous strains of corn, and in these wild formations connected to kind of atrocities that have happened there, and then the corn will be a feast that the community will have. So I'm interested in non-static memorials and memorials that kind of make stuff of the wreckage and also are themselves kind of transformations of a space. So that might be one. I know that's sort of an abstraction. It's hard to talk about this stuff sometimes without being an abstraction because you have to sort of see it. But yeah, I'm kind of interested in memorials that move, you know, like physically move. Another one, this is not climate related, but like an example is like the NRA, not the NRA, the anti-NRA, the like parents against for gun control, created these buses, or this bus brigade. I don't know if anyone has seen this, but a bus brigade of the number of children who in the past 10 years or something like that have died from gun violence, and take the number of buses that could fit that number of children and drive it around and like park it in front of Ted Cruz's house or park it in front of like wherever. And yes, that is focusing on the loss, but it's also focusing on the like, there is something that we can do here, which is create gun control, you monsters, you know. And that is really interesting and moving to me. It's not just a like, let's mourn this, but let's do something about it. I see this question. Did I land on a new word for you were trying to describe the Bureau of Linguistic Morality? Honestly, not really. Part of what was interesting is that like what their process did for me was more reignite my relationship to language and defamiliarize language to me in such a way that I found it meaningful again. And it turned out to be, I mean, spoiler alert, really not, but it turned out to be less about the word itself and more an engagement with language as component parts, in language as component parts in order to feel it alive and possible again, which was really helpful because I'm a writer. So it was a real bummer to feel like words weren't useful anymore.
Thanks. We're getting pretty close to the end of our talk, but several people have asked this and have asked me to call this out. But Zach asked the question, any thoughts about social media platforms?
I saw that. Yeah, I mean, you know, very terrifying who owns social media platforms, what they do with them, you know, the profit that is made off of our engagement, etc. However, I actually have to say that I find like when I was in Greece, it was through Instagram that I was seeing what was happening in LA. You know, yes, I was reading the newspaper, but I was with a 2.5-year-old in Greece, also reporting all day. You know, like I was looking at Instagram and that's where I was seeing really, really powerful videos. I also think mutual aid efforts are happening on social media in these really meaningful, beautiful ways. I do think that social media has like there are, you know, not good or bad, I think. I mean, but it's like, it's there, you know, it exists. And so I'm interested in focusing on ways that we can continue to use the tools that we have at our disposal for good, even if they are owned by evil. Also, I joined Blue Sky, you know, like I don't know, I guess I do think that there is real power in narrative storytelling and in communication and connection via social media as well.
Thank you. And we are butting up right against the hour and want to be respectful of your time, Lauren, and everyone else's. So thank you so very, very much. If you want to stick around and answer more questions, you're welcome. But otherwise, I just want to say thank you all for joining. Thank you, Lauren, for being here and sharing. And I personally cannot wait to read your book. So it's very exciting to see that coming out. So thanks all. And current fellows, you will be talking about this keynote in your labs next week. Take care all.
So much, everyone. Such an honor to be here with you.
Thank you.